The morning sun cast long shadows across Washington Square as thousands of protesters gathered for what organizers called a peaceful demonstration against military involvement overseas. Signs waved in the crisp October air, voices rose in unified chants, and the energy was electric with purpose and passion. Among the crowd stood Marcus Thompson, a 72-year-old Vietnam veteran who had come not to protest, but simply to observe. He wore his old dress uniform, the same one he had worn to receive his Purple Heart 47 years earlier. The fabric was faded but clean, the metals polished to a shine. Marcus believed in the right to protest, even when he disagreed with the message. Democracy, he often told his grandchildren, meant protecting everyone's voice. The demonstration had been largely peaceful for the first 2 hours. Police officers lined the perimeter, watchful but relaxed. News crews captured footage of families with children, college students with painted faces, and elderly activists sharing stories from previous generations of protest movements. The atmosphere felt more like a community gathering than a political uprising. But as the crowd swelled beyond the expected numbers, tensions began to shift. A group of more radical protesters pushed toward the front, their chants growing aggressive, their signs carrying darker messages. Among them was Jake Morrison, a 23-year-old college dropout who had spent the last 3 years bouncing between protest movements, always seeking the next cause that might give his life meaning. Jake spotted Marcus, standing quietly near a park bench, hands clasped behind his back, simply watching. The sight of the military uniform triggered something visceral in Jake's mind. Here was everything he believed was wrong with America. Everything that represented the military-industrial complex he had read about in online forums and heard about in late-night discussions in cramped apartments. Without warning, Jake broke from his group and strode directly toward Marcus. The older man noticed the young protester approaching, but remained calm, assuming perhaps the young man wanted to engage in civil discussion. Marcus had always believed that talking across differences was how democracy stayed healthy. "You proud of yourself, old man?" Jake's voice cut through the ambient noise of the crowd. His face was flushed with anger, eyes blazing with righteous fury. "Proud of all the innocent people your generation killed?" Marcus turned to face Jake fully, his expression remaining peaceful despite the aggressive tone. "Son, I believe everyone has the right to their opinion. That's what I fought to protect." The response only inflamed Jake further. To him, Marcus's calm demeanor represented everything he despised about what he saw as the military establishment's arrogance. Without thinking, Jake grabbed a cup of coffee from a nearby protester's hand and hurled it directly at Marcus's chest, the dark liquid splashing across the ribbons and metals. The crowd around them fell silent, a circle of shocked faces forming as people processed what they had just witnessed. Marcus looked down at his stained uniform, coffee dripping from metals that represented moments of courage and sacrifice that Jake could never understand. The Purple Heart his wife had pinned on his chest in the hospital after he returned home, wounded, now bore dark stains. But Jake wasn't finished. Emboldened by the attention and convinced he was making a powerful statement, he reached forward and grabbed the front of Marcus's jacket, yanking hard enough to tear one of the older ribbons from its mounting. "This uniform is a symbol of oppression," Jake shouted, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet square. "You're nothing but a paid killer." Marcus staggered backward, more from surprise than the physical force. At 72, his balance wasn't what it once was, and he had to grab the park bench to steady himself. The torn ribbon fell to the ground, and Jake deliberately stepped on it, grinding it into the concrete with his heel. What neither Jake nor the surrounding crowd knew was that among the police officers maintaining the perimeter were 2 men who weren't actually police officers at all. Staff Sergeant Mike Rodriguez and Sergeant First Class David Chun were both active-duty Delta Force operators conducting security reconnaissance in civilian clothes, part of a broader counterintelligence operation monitoring potential threats in major metropolitan areas. Both men had been watching the demonstration with professional interest, noting crowd dynamics, identifying potential agitators, and cataloging escape routes and security vulnerabilities. They had noticed Jake's group earlier, flagging them as potential troublemakers, but nothing they had observed suggested anything beyond typical protest activities. That changed the moment they witnessed Jake's assault on Marcus. Rodriguez spoke quietly into a concealed microphone, his words barely audible even to Chun standing beside him. "Control, we have a situation developing. Elderly veteran being physically assaulted by protester. Subject appears to be escalating." The response crackled through their nearly invisible earpieces. "Maintain observation. Do not engage unless civilian safety becomes critical." But as Rodriguez and Chun watched Jake continue his verbal assault on Marcus, something deeper than their professional training began to stir. Both men were combat veterans themselves, Rodriguez having served 3 tours in Afghanistan, Chun having spent 2 years in Iraq followed by classified operations in Eastern Europe. They watched as Marcus, despite being humiliated and assaulted, refused to retaliate or even raise his voice in response to Jake's continued taunts. The old soldier simply bent down, picked up his torn ribbon, and attempted to brush the coffee stains from his uniform with quiet dignity. Jake, interpreting Marcus's restraint as weakness, decided to escalate further. He began shouting for the crowd's attention, pointing at Marcus and declaring him a war criminal who deserved no respect. Several other young protesters, caught up in the moment and mob mentality, began joining in with jeers and accusations. It was when Jake reached forward to grab Marcus's Purple Heart medal, attempting to rip it from the uniform entirely, that Rodriguez and Chin simultaneously moved. Their training kicked in with mechanical precision. Both men began pushing through the crowd, their movements coordinated despite having given no visible signals to each other. Years of working together in high-stress situations had created an almost telepathic understanding between them. "Control, we're moving in." Rodriguez's voice was barely a whisper as he spoke into his concealed microphone. "Situation has escalated beyond acceptable parameters." What happened next would be talked about in military circles for years to come, analyzed in training scenarios, and eventually become part of urban legend among both law enforcement and military personnel. But none of that mattered to Rodriguez and Chun in that moment. All that mattered was that a fellow veteran was being humiliated by someone who had never risked anything for the freedoms he was exercising, and they were in a position to do something about it. The crowd continued to watch, unaware that what they were witnessing was about to shift from a simple protest incident into something far more significant. Marcus continued to stand with quiet dignity, unaware that help was approaching through the mass of people surrounding him. And Jake Morrison, drunk on what he perceived as his moment of triumph, had no idea that his actions had just attracted the attention of 2 of the most highly trained soldiers in the United States military. The crowd's attention was completely focused on the confrontation between Jake and Marcus when Rodriguez and Chin materialized beside them. One moment, they were invisible faces in the mass of protesters. The next, they stood flanking Jake with the kind of presence that made people instinctively step back. Jake felt their approach before he saw them. Something primal in his brain registered danger, the same evolutionary warning system that had kept humans alive for millennia. He turned to find himself looking up at Rodriguez, whose dark eyes carried the kind of intensity that comes only from years of life-or-death decision-making. "Step away from the veteran," Rodriguez said quietly. His voice carried no threat, no aggression, just absolute certainty that his words would be obeyed. Jake's first instinct was to challenge this interference. He was riding high on adrenaline and the attention of the crowd. In his mind, he was a righteous warrior fighting against oppression. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded, trying to summon the same aggressive energy he had directed at Marcus. Chun moved slightly, positioning himself so that he could see both Jake's hands and scan the surrounding crowd for additional threats. His movement was subtle, professional, almost casual, but anyone with military training would have recognized it immediately as a tactical positioning. "We're asking nicely," Chun said, his tone matching Rodriguez's calm authority. "This gentleman deserves respect." The crowd around them began to sense that something fundamental had shifted. The energy that had been building toward mob mentality suddenly felt different, more dangerous. Conversations died away as people tried to understand what was happening. Jake looked back and forth between the two men, his bravado beginning to crack as his brain processed what his eyes were seeing. Both Rodriguez and Chin carried themselves with an unmistakable bearing that transcended clothing or context. Despite wearing civilian clothes, everything about their posture, their awareness, their controlled movements screamed military training at the highest level. "This is a free country," Jake said, but his voice had lost its earlier confidence. "I have the right to protest." "You have the right to protest," Rodriguez agreed. "You don't have the right to assault someone." Marcus, who had been quietly trying to clean his uniform, looked up at his unexpected defenders with surprise. He could see immediately that these weren't ordinary Good Samaritans or even regular police officers. Their bearing, their awareness, the way they positioned themselves spoke of training that went far beyond civilian law enforcement. "It's all right, gentlemen," Marcus said softly. "The young man is upset. People have the right to express their feelings." But Rodriguez and Chen weren't looking at Marcus anymore. Their attention was focused on Jake's group of friends, who were beginning to press forward in support of their companion. What had started as a confrontation between two individuals was beginning to escalate into something potentially much more serious. Jake's friend Tommy, a lanky 20-year-old with multiple piercings and anti-establishment tattoos covering his arms, pushed to the front of the group. "Back off, fascists," he shouted. "Leave Jake alone." The word fascists hung in the air like a verbal grenade. Rodriguez and Chun exchanged the briefest of glances, a micro-communication that spoke volumes about their shared assessment of the situation. Chin spoke into his concealed microphone, his words barely audible. "Control, we have multiple agitators now involved. Situation expanding beyond initial parameters." The response was immediate. "Additional assets are en route. Maintain position and protect civilian." What the protesters didn't know was that additional assets didn't mean regular police backup. The counterintelligence operation that Rodriguez and Chun were part of was much larger and more sophisticated than anyone in the crowd could have imagined. Jake, emboldened by his friend's support and increasingly angry at what he perceived as intimidation, made a critical error in judgment. He decided to escalate the confrontation by pushing Rodriguez in the chest, a move designed to provoke a response that he could then claim was police brutality or military oppression. Rodriguez didn't budge. Jake's shove, delivered with all the force he could muster, barely moved the Delta Force operator. It was like pushing against a mountain. Rodriguez looked down at the hand that had touched his chest, then back up at Jake's face. "That was a mistake," Rodriguez said quietly. The crowd around them began to buzz with nervous energy. Phones appeared as people started recording, sensing that something significant was about to happen. The peaceful demonstration was transforming into something none of them had expected when they woke up that morning. Chen's earpiece crackled with new information. "Assets in position around the perimeter. We have eyes on the situation." What Jake and his friends couldn't see was that in the span of just 3 minutes, 6 additional Delta Force operators had taken positions throughout the square. They blended seamlessly with the crowd, indistinguishable from protesters, journalists, and curious onlookers. But their presence created an invisible net of security around the developing situation. Marcus, despite his age and the assault he had endured, began to recognize what was happening. His military experience, though decades old, had taught him to read tactical situations. He could see the subtle signs that the two men defending him weren't alone, that whatever was unfolding was much larger than a simple intervention. "Son," Marcus said to Jake, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had earned the right to speak, "you should listen to these gentlemen." But Jake was past the point of rational decision-making. Surrounded by his friends, with cameras recording, and convinced that he was fighting some kind of symbolic battle against military oppression, he made another catastrophic choice. He swung at Rodriguez. The punch was telegraphed, clumsy, and delivered by someone whose only fighting experience came from video games and internet tough guy fantasies. Rodriguez could have stopped it a dozen different ways. He could have blocked it, deflected it, or simply stepped aside. Instead, he caught Jake's fist in his hand and held it, demonstrating the kind of reflexes and strength that come only from years of elite training. Jake's forward momentum stopped as if he had run into a brick wall. "Last warning," Rodriguez said, releasing Jake's fist. "Walk away." The crowd fell completely silent. Even the most vocal protesters seemed to sense that they were witnessing something beyond their understanding. The atmosphere had shifted from political demonstration to something that felt much more dangerous and unpredictable. Jake looked around at the sea of faces staring at him, at the phones recording his every move, at his friends waiting to see what he would do next. In his mind, backing down now would mean admitting defeat, surrendering to everything he claimed to oppose. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folding knife. The moment the blade appeared, everything changed. Chen's hand moved to his concealed weapon while Rodriguez stepped protectively in front of Marcus. Around the perimeter of the square, 6 additional operators began moving through the crowd with purpose and speed. Jake held the knife in front of him, his hand shaking with adrenaline and fear. "Stay back," he shouted. "This is our square. This is our demonstration." Rodriguez and Chun both knew that the situation had just crossed a line from which there was no return. The moment a weapon appeared, their rules of engagement changed completely. They were no longer 2 soldiers trying to prevent an assault on an elderly veteran. They were now neutralizing a legitimate threat to civilian safety. "Control," Chin said quietly into his microphone. "Weapon is now in play." Requesting immediate authorization. The response came back instantly. Authorization granted. Neutralize the threat. What happened next would be analyzed by law enforcement agencies, military training institutions, and protest organizers for years to come. But in that moment, all that mattered was that Jake Morrison had just pulled a knife on 2 Delta Force operators in a crowded public square. And Marcus Thompson, the 72-year-old Vietnam veteran whose only crime had been wearing his uniform to observe a protest, was about to see his country's most elite soldiers demonstrate exactly why they carried that designation. The transformation was instantaneous and absolute. The moment Jake's knife became visible, Rodriguez and Chin shifted from concerned observers to operational mode. Their movements became fluid, precise, and utterly professional. Years of training in the world's most dangerous situations took over. Rodriguez stepped forward with movements so smooth they seemed almost casual. His left hand swept up in a controlled arc that intercepted Jake's knife hand at the wrist, while his right hand secured Jake's elbow. The technique was executed with such precision that Jake found himself completely immobilized before his brain could even process what was happening. The knife clattered to the concrete as Jake's fingers went numb from the pressure point Rodriguez had found with surgical accuracy. Jake tried to pull away, but discovered that he might as well have been trying to escape from steel cables. Rodriguez's grip was absolute and unbreakable. "Don't move," Rodriguez said quietly. His voice carried no emotion, no anger, just the cold professionalism of someone who had subdued far more dangerous opponents in far more dangerous places. Chin had moved simultaneously, positioning himself to intercept any of Jake's friends who might try to intervene. His stance was relaxed, but ready like a coiled spring. His eyes swept the crowd constantly, assessing threats and escape routes with the automatic efficiency of someone trained to survive in hostile environments. The crowd had fallen completely silent except for the clicking of camera phones and the distant sounds of city traffic. Even the most vocal protesters seemed to understand that they were witnessing something far beyond their experience or understanding. Jake's friends stood frozen in place, their earlier bravado evaporating as they realized their companion was being held by someone whose capabilities they couldn't even begin to comprehend. Tommy started to step forward, then stopped as Chin's gaze fixed on him with laser intensity. "I wouldn't," Chin said quietly. Your friend made a very poor decision. Don't compound it. Around the perimeter of the square, the other Delta Force operators had begun their coordinated response. To the casual observer, they were simply people in the crowd moving naturally. But their movements followed a pattern of tactical deployment that would have been immediately recognizable to anyone with advanced military training. Sergeant Lisa Park, disguised as a young graduate student with a backpack and protest sign, had positioned herself near the main entrance to the square. Master Sergeant James Wilson, appearing to be a middle-aged businessman checking his phone, controlled the secondary exit points. Four others had taken positions that created an invisible security perimeter around the central confrontation. Marcus watched the coordinated response with growing amazement and concern. His military experience was decades old, but he could still recognize tactical movement when he saw it. These weren't just two good Samaritans who had stepped in to help. This was a coordinated military operation unfolding in the middle of a civilian demonstration. "Gentlemen," Marcus said carefully, "while I appreciate your assistance, perhaps we should let the local police handle this situation." Chin glanced at Marcus with something that might have been a smile. "Sir, with all due respect, we are handling this situation." Jake, still immobilized in Rodriguez's grip, tried desperately to understand what was happening to him. The pain in his wrist and arm was unlike anything he had ever experienced, a combination of pressure and positioning that made resistance not just futile, but impossible. "Who are you people?" Jake gasped through the discomfort. "We're the people you really didn't want to mess with today," Rodriguez replied calmly. The crowd began to stir as people noticed the coordinated movements around the perimeter. Protesters who had been focused on the central confrontation started to realize that something much larger was happening around them. The demonstration's organizers began pushing through the crowd, trying to understand what had transformed their peaceful protest into what looked increasingly like a security operation. Sarah Martinez, one of the protest leaders, reached the inner circle and immediately recognized that the situation had escalated far beyond anything they had planned or prepared for. She was an experienced organizer who had coordinated dozens of demonstrations over the past 5 years, and her instincts told her that whatever was happening wasn't typical law enforcement response. "Excuse me," she said to Chun, trying to project authority while remaining respectful. "I'm one of the organizers of this demonstration. Can you tell me what's happening here?" Chin's response was polite, but final. "Ma'am, you have someone in your group who assaulted an elderly veteran and then pulled a weapon in a crowded public space. We're addressing that situation. But who are you?" Sarah pressed. "Are you police? Federal agents? You need to identify yourselves." Before Chen could respond, Rodriguez's earpiece crackled with new information. "Control to team leader. We have media attention increasing. News vans arriving on scene. Recommend expedited resolution." Rodriguez processed this information quickly. Media attention would complicate everything. Once news crews began broadcasting live footage of what appeared to be a military operation in a civilian protest, questions would be asked that his chain of command would prefer not to answer. "Copy that, Control," Rodriguez said quietly into his concealed microphone. Initiating extraction protocols. To the crowd around them, Rodriguez appeared to be having a one-sided conversation with himself. But Marcus's old military instincts recognized communication patterns when he heard them, even if he couldn't understand the specific content. Jake's friend Tommy, emboldened by the arrival of the protest organizers and convinced that safety lay in numbers, decided to make another attempt to help his friend. He pulled out his cell phone and began shouting, "Police brutality! Someone call the real police. These aren't cops." His shouts attracted more attention from the crowd, and several other protesters began pulling out their phones to record what they believed might be an illegal detention. The mood of the demonstration began to shift again, this time toward potential confrontation with what people were beginning to perceive as some kind of undercover security force. Chun assessed the changing crowd dynamics with professional detachment. Mob psychology was something he had studied extensively during his training. He could see the telltale signs that the demonstration was beginning to transform from curious observation to potential hostile action. "Rodriguez," Chin said quietly, We're about to have a crowd control situation." Rodriguez looked up from Jake, his eyes scanning the faces around them. He could see the shift Sean was referring to. The crowd was beginning to press closer, their earlier passive observation giving way to more active engagement. Phone cameras were everywhere now, and voices were beginning to rise in challenge and demand. "Control," Rodriguez said into his microphone. "Recommend immediate backup from local law enforcement. Situation is becoming politically sensitive." The response was immediate. "Local PD en route. Maintain position until they arrive, then disengage quietly." But quietly was becoming increasingly difficult as more protesters realized that something significant was happening. The crowd was growing larger as word spread throughout the square that some kind of confrontation was taking place. Marcus, watching the situation develop around him, made a decision that surprised everyone. He stepped forward, positioning himself between the Delta Force operators and the increasingly agitated crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard, "I want everyone to understand what happened here." The crowd quieted slightly, curious to hear from the elderly veteran who had been at the center of the original confrontation. "This young man assaulted me," Marcus continued, gesturing toward Jake, who was still immobilized in Rodriguez's grip. "He threw coffee on my uniform, tore my ribbons, and then pulled a knife. These men stepped in to protect me when no one else would." Sarah Martinez looked back and forth between Marcus and the two men holding Jake, trying to process the information and understand the larger implications of what she was hearing. "Sir," she said to Marcus, "we appreciate your service, and I'm sorry this happened. But these men haven't identified themselves as law enforcement. For all we know, they could be anyone." Rodriguez made another quick decision. The situation was becoming too complex for continued concealment. Local police sirens were becoming audible in the distance. Media vans were setting up outside the square, and the crowd was growing more agitated by the minute. He reached into his jacket and produced a badge case, flashing credentials so quickly that no one in the crowd could read the details, but everyone could see the unmistakable look of federal identification. "We're federal agents," Rodriguez said simply, "and this situation is now under federal jurisdiction." The lie was technically a lie, but practically accurate. Delta Force operators did carry federal credentials for situations exactly like this one. And while they weren't exactly agents in the traditional sense, they were federal personnel operating under lawful authority. The crowd's reaction was immediate and polarized. Some protesters began backing away, intimidated by the suggestion of federal involvement. Others pressed closer, energized by what they perceived as government overreach at their peaceful demonstration. Jake, still held immobile by Rodriguez's expert grip, finally found his voice again. "Federal agents?" he gasped. "For what?" "I was just exercising my First Amendment rights." "Your First Amendment rights ended when you assaulted someone and pulled a weapon," Chen replied calmly. "After that, you became a criminal matter." The sound of police sirens was growing closer now, and Rodriguez could see the first patrol cars beginning to navigate through the crowd at the edges of the square. The cavalry was arriving, but whether that would simplify the situation or complicate it further remained to be seen. What none of them could have anticipated was that the arrival of local police would trigger a chain of events that would transform a simple assault incident into a national news story that would be analyzed and debated for years to come. The first police car to arrive belonged to Sergeant Rebecca Walsh, a 15-year veteran of the Metropolitan Police Force who had seen every type of crowd disturbance imaginable. But as she stepped out of her patrol car and surveyed the scene before her, she immediately knew this was unlike anything in her previous experience. The crowd was arranged in a perfect circle around a central point, their body language suggesting a mixture of fascination and unease. In the center, she could see two men in civilian clothes maintaining what appeared to be a professional detention of a young protester. Around the perimeter, she noticed other individuals who seemed to be positioned with military precision, though they appeared to be casual observers. Walsh's radio crackled as she approached the crowd. Unit 47, we have media vans setting up outside the square. Be advised the situation may have political sensitivity. Copy that. Dispatch, Walsh replied, pushing through the crowd toward the center of the disturbance. Her trained eye immediately recognized that whatever was happening here involved people with significantly more tactical training than typical protesters or even typical criminals. As she reached the inner circle, Rodriguez looked up and made eye contact with her. The relief on his face was subtle, but unmistakable. Local law enforcement meant the situation could be transferred to appropriate civilian authority, which would allow his team to extract themselves before questions became too complicated. "Officer," Rodriguez said, maintaining his grip on Jake while addressing Walsh, "we have a suspect who assaulted an elderly veteran and then produced a weapon when confronted." Walsh looked from Rodriguez to Jake to Marcus, quickly assessing the situation. Her experience told her that the two men in civilian clothes were law enforcement of some kind, but their bearing and coordination suggested federal rather than local authority. "Can I see some identification?" Walsh asked Rodriguez. Rodriguez produced his credentials again, this time allowing Walsh to examine them more carefully. Her eyes widened slightly as she read the federal identification, though she was professional enough to keep her reaction minimal. "Federal agents," she said, more as a statement than a question. "What brings federal jurisdiction to a local demonstration?" "We were conducting routine security assessment when we witnessed the assault," Chen replied smoothly. "The weapon escalated it to our level of concern." Jake, who had been largely quiet during Rodriguez's detention, suddenly found his voice again as he saw the police officer. "Officer, these men attacked me. I was just exercising my rights to protest, and they grabbed me." Walsh looked down at Jake, then at the knife still lying on the concrete beside them. "Is it your knife, son?" I was defending myself," Jake stammered. "They threatened me." Marcus stepped forward, his coffee-stained uniform and torn ribbon providing silent testimony to Jake's earlier actions. "Officer," the young man threw coffee at me, tore my uniform, and then pulled that knife when these gentlemen asked him to stop. Walsh nodded, her assessment of the situation becoming clearer. She had dealt with hundreds of protest-related incidents over her career, and the pattern here was familiar, even if the response was unusually professional. Her radio crackled again. "Unit 47, we have news crews requesting access to the scene. Lieutenant wants to know if you need additional backup." "Negative on additional backup at this time," Walsh replied. "But keep media at the perimeter until I sort this out." The mention of media attention caused Rodriguez and Chun to exchange glances. Their operation had been designed to remain low profile, and media scrutiny was the last thing their chain of command wanted. Rodriguez spoke quietly to Walsh. "Officer, we prefer to transfer custody to local authority and extract quietly. This doesn't need to become a federal incident." Walsh understood the subtext immediately. Whatever federal operation these men were part of, they wanted to avoid publicity as much as she wanted to avoid jurisdictional complications. "Understood," she said. "Let me take custody of the suspect, and you can provide a brief statement for my report." Sarah Martinez, the protest organizer, had been listening to this exchange with growing concern. The realization that federal agents had been operating within their peaceful demonstration raised questions about surveillance and civil liberties that went far beyond the original incident. "Excuse me, officer," Sarah said to Walsh, "but I think our legal observer should be involved in this conversation." She gestured to a young woman with a legal aid badge who had been documenting the demonstration. Legal observers were a standard presence at protests, trained to monitor police interactions and protect protesters' rights. The legal observer, Amanda Chun, no relation to the Delta Force operator, approached with her notebook and camera ready. She had observed hundreds of protest arrests, but something about this situation felt different and potentially significant. "I'd like to document what charges are being filed and ensure the suspect's rights are being protected," Amanda said to Walsh. Rodriguez realized that the situation was becoming more complicated rather than less. Legal observers meant documentation, which meant potential scrutiny of their involvement. His earpiece crackled with updates from his team. News crews are interviewing protesters. Someone posted a video on social media. This is going viral. Officer Walsh, Rodriguez said quietly, we really need to expedite this transfer. But Jake's friend Tommy chose that moment to make the situation significantly worse. Emboldened by the presence of police and legal observers, and convinced that his friend was being illegally detained, he decided to take action. Tommy pushed through the crowd and grabbed at Rodriguez's arm, trying to force him to release Jake. Let him go. You have no right to hold him. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Chen moved to intercept Tommy while Rodriguez maintained his hold on Jake. Two other Delta Force operators materialized from the crowd to provide backup, their movements so coordinated and professional that even experienced Officer Walsh was momentarily stunned. Within seconds, Tommy found himself face down on the concrete with his hands zip-tied behind his back, completely immobilized by someone who had appeared out of nowhere and moved with textbook precision. The crowd's reaction was electric. Shouts of police brutality and federal overreach erupted from multiple directions. Phones appeared everywhere as protesters documented what they believed was an excessive use of force against peaceful demonstrators. Amanda Chun, the legal observer, was furiously taking notes and photos, recognizing that she was witnessing something that would likely result in significant legal and political ramifications. This is excessive force, Sarah Martinez shouted. These are peaceful protesters. Walsh found herself in the middle of a rapidly escalating situation that was far beyond anything she had been prepared to handle. Her radio exploded with chatter as dispatch received multiple calls about the incident, and she could see news crews pushing against the police perimeter trying to get closer to the action. Rodriguez's earpiece delivered information that made the situation even more complex. Team leader, we have confirmed social media posts going viral. Video shows federal agents at protest. Command wants immediate extraction. But extraction was no longer simple. They now had two suspects in custody, an agitated crowd, media attention, and a legal observer documenting everything. The quiet resolution they had hoped for was no longer possible. Marcus, watching the situation spiral out of control around him, stepped forward again. Despite being the original victim, he seemed to be the calmest person in the entire square. Officers, gentlemen, he said, his voice carrying clearly over the crowd noise. Perhaps we're making this more complicated than it needs to be. He looked around at the faces surrounding him, at the phones recording everything, at the protest signs, and the torn ribbons still lying on the concrete. I'm an old soldier, Marcus continued. I've seen what happens when good people on different sides stop listening to each other. This young man made some poor choices, but I don't think anyone needs to have their life destroyed over it. The crowd quieted slightly, surprised by the veteran's moderate tone given what he had endured. But what I won't accept, Marcus said, his voice growing stronger, is the idea that there's anything wrong with these gentlemen stepping in to help when someone needed help. Whatever else is going on here, they did the right thing. Rodriguez looked at Marcus with something approaching respect. Even in the middle of a situation that was rapidly becoming a political incident, the old veteran was trying to de-escalate and find common ground. But the crowd's attention was suddenly drawn to the police perimeter, where news crews had begun broadcasting live reports about federal agents operating at a protest. The demonstration was about to become national news, and everyone in the square was about to discover that their small incident had much larger implications than anyone had anticipated. Walsh's radio delivered the message that would change everything. Unit 47, be advised that Federal Command is en route to your location. ETA, 5 minutes. Rodriguez closed his eyes briefly, knowing that the arrival of Federal Command meant their quiet operation had just become a very public political incident. The simple assault case had evolved into something that would likely be investigated by Congress, analyzed by think tanks, and debated in editorial pages across the country. Jake, still immobilized but able to hear everything happening around him, began to realize that his moment of anger had triggered consequences far beyond anything he had imagined when he threw coffee at an old veteran's uniform. The black SUVs arrived exactly 5 minutes later, their presence immediately transforming the atmosphere in the square. 3 vehicles pulled up to the police perimeter with the kind of coordination that made it clear this wasn't a hastily assembled response, but a well-orchestrated operation by people accustomed to managing complex situations. From the lead vehicle stepped Colonel Patricia Harrison, a career military officer whose presence commanded immediate respect from everyone within sight. She wore civilian clothes, but her bearing and the deference shown by the Delta Force operators made her authority unmistakable. Rodriguez spoke quietly into his microphone as she approached, package delivered. Command on scene. Colonel Harrison surveyed the situation with the kind of rapid assessment that comes from decades of military leadership. She took in the crowd, the media presence, the detained suspects, and the obvious tension in less than 30 seconds. Sergeant Rodriguez, she said quietly as she reached the center of the disturbance. Report. Elderly veteran assaulted by protester who then produced a weapon. Situation escalated when suspect's associate interfered with lawful detention. Media attention became significant before we could extract quietly. Harrison nodded, understanding immediately both what had happened and what the implications would be. She looked at Jake, still held immobile by Rodriguez, then at Tommy on the ground, then at Marcus standing quietly with his stained uniform. Sir, she said to Marcus, her voice respectful but professional, I'm Colonel Harrison. I understand you were assaulted today. Marcus looked at the colonel with surprise. He had not expected someone of such obvious high rank to become involved in what had started as a simple protest incident. Ma'am, yes, but I don't think this needs to become a major incident, Marcus replied. The young man was upset about things he doesn't understand. These gentlemen helped me when I needed help. That should be enough. Harrison studied Marcus for a moment, recognizing the kind of veteran who had served with honor and retained perspective despite personal hardship. Mr. Thompson, I appreciate your attitude, but when someone assaults a veteran and pulls a weapon in a public space, it becomes more than a personal matter. The crowd around them had grown significantly as word spread throughout the square that federal officials were now involved. Sarah Martinez and the other protest organizers were trying to maintain some control over their demonstration, but the situation had evolved far beyond anything they had planned or could manage. Amanda Chun, the legal observer, continued documenting everything, recognizing that she was witnessing what could become a significant civil liberties case. Her photos and notes would likely be subpoenaed by multiple congressional committees and civil rights organizations in the coming weeks. Officer Walsh approached Colonel Harrison with the respect due to federal authority, but also with the caution of someone whose local jurisdiction was being complicated by outside involvement. Colonel, what's the federal interest in this situation? Walsh asked professionally. Harrison's response was measured and diplomatic. Officer Walsh, my people were conducting routine security assessment when they witnessed a crime. They intervened to protect a civilian. The situation escalated beyond their control when weapons appeared and additional suspects became involved. The explanation was technically accurate while revealing nothing about the actual scope or purpose of the Delta Force operation that had been underway in the square. Jake, who had been listening to this exchange with growing understanding of how serious the situation had become, finally spoke up. I want a lawyer, he said, his earlier bravado completely gone. I want to know what I'm being charged with. Colonel Harrison looked down at Jake with the kind of expression reserved for people who had made spectacularly poor decisions. Mr. Morrison, you assaulted a 72-year-old veteran, damaged his uniform, and then pulled a knife in a crowded public space. You're being charged with assault, destruction of property, and threatening with a deadly weapon. But I was protesting. Jake protested weakly. I have rights. You have the right to protest peacefully, Harrison replied. You don't have the right to assault people or threaten them with weapons. Those rights ended the moment you put your hands on Mr. Thompson. Tommy, still zip-tied on the ground, tried to speak but found that his position made conversation difficult. One of the Delta Force operators helped him to a sitting position, though his hands remained secured. "This is police brutality," Tommy managed to say. "We were just trying to help our friend." Chen looked down at Tommy with the patience of someone explaining simple concepts to a child. "Your friend committed a crime. When you physically interfered with his lawful detention, you became an accessory. That's not police brutality. That's consequence." The news crews outside the perimeter were becoming increasingly aggressive in their attempts to get closer to the action. Walsh's radio crackled with reports that reporters were interviewing protesters and broadcasting live updates about federal agents operating at the demonstration. Colonel Harrison's phone buzzed with a text message that she read quickly. Her expression grew more serious as she processed the information. "Gentlemen," she said to Rodriguez and Chund, "we have congressional interest. 3 different representatives are already issuing statements about federal overreach at peaceful protests." Rodriguez grimaced. Congressional attention meant investigations, hearings, and the kind of public scrutiny that special operations units were designed to avoid. "Ma'am," Rodriguez said quietly, "recommendations for managing the political fallout." "We tell the truth," Harrison replied firmly. "My operators witnessed a crime and intervened to protect a civilian. Everything else is politics, and politicians can worry about politics." Marcus, who had been quietly observing the interactions around him, stepped forward again. Despite being the victim of the original assault, he seemed to be the person most concerned with finding a reasonable resolution. "Colonel, Officer Walsh, everyone," Marcus said, his voice carrying clearly, "I've been thinking about what happened here today, and I want to say something." The crowd quieted, curious to hear from the veteran who had been at the center of everything. "This young man did something stupid," Marcus continued, looking at Jake. "He was angry about things he doesn't understand, and he took that anger out on someone who represented what he thought was wrong with the world." He paused, looking around at the faces surrounding him. "But you know what? When I was his age, I was angry about things too. I protested things I didn't like. The difference is that I learned to channel that anger into something constructive instead of destructive." Jake looked up at Marcus with something that might have been shame beginning to show in his eyes. "I don't want to ruin this young man's life," Marcus said. "I want him to learn from this. I want him to understand that the uniform he attacked represents people who died so he could have the right to protest in the first place." The square had fallen completely silent except for the distant sounds of traffic and the clicking of camera phones recording Marcus's words. "So here's what I propose," Marcus continued. "Instead of federal charges and prison time, how about community service? How about this young man spend some time with veterans, learning their stories, understanding what service really means?" Colonel Harrison looked at Marcus with respect and consideration. "Mr. Thompson, that's a generous offer, but assault with a weapon is a serious crime." "It is," Marcus agreed, "but so is destroying a young person's future over a moment of stupidity. These gentlemen did their job protecting me. Now, let's do our job as Americans and find a way to make something good come out of something bad." The suggestion hung in the air as everyone processed its implications. Sarah Martinez and the other protest organizers began to see a potential way to resolve the situation that wouldn't result in their demonstration being remembered as a violent confrontation with federal agents. Amanda Chun continued taking notes, recognizing that Marcus's proposal could become a model for how political tensions might be resolved through understanding rather than punishment. Officer Walsh looked to Colonel Harrison for guidance on how to proceed. The situation had evolved far beyond typical law enforcement protocols, and the political implications required decisions above her pay grade. Colonel Harrison studied the faces around her, taking in the crowd, the media presence, the detained suspects, and, most importantly, the dignified veteran who was asking for mercy for the person who had attacked him. "Mr. Thompson," she said finally, "your proposal has merit, but it needs to go through proper legal channels. Mr. Morrison and his friend will be processed according to law, but I'll make sure the prosecutor understands your position. She turned to address the crowd more broadly, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard and obeyed. Ladies and gentlemen, what happened here today started with one person's poor decision to assault another person. It escalated when weapons appeared and when others chose to interfere with lawful responses to crime. The federal agents you see here were doing their job protecting American citizens, which is exactly what they're trained to do. The crowd listened intently as she continued. But Mr. Thompson has shown us something important today. He's shown us that Americans can choose forgiveness over vengeance, understanding over hatred, and solutions over problems. That's the kind of leadership this country needs more of. As the suspect were formally transferred to police custody and the crowd began to disperse, the incident that had started with coffee thrown at an old soldier's uniform had become something much larger. It would be analyzed in congressional hearings, debated in editorial pages, and studied in military academies as an example of how small actions can have enormous consequences. But perhaps most importantly, it had become a story about an elderly veteran who chose mercy over justice, and about the kind of character that comes from understanding what service really means. In the weeks that followed, Jake Morrison would indeed spend time with veterans, learning their stories and beginning to understand the cost of the freedoms he had taken for granted. And Marcus Thompson would become a symbol of the kind of American who makes democracy work, not through anger or protest, but through dignity, forgiveness, and the quiet strength that comes from having served something greater than oneself.